Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Professor Alan Lightman and Professor Dacher Keltner. Thank you for joining us. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 350 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some introductions. We're so thrilled to be welcoming Alan Lightman, who earned his Ph.D. in physics from the California Institute of Technology and is the author of 7 novels, including the international bestseller Einstein's Dreams and The Diagnosis, a finalist for the National Book Award. His nonfiction includes The Transcendental Brain, The Accidental Universe, Searching for Stars on an Island in Maine, and Probable Impossibilities. Alan has taught at Harvard and at MIT, where he was the first person to receive a dual faculty appointment in science and the humanities. He is currently a professor of the practice of the humanities at MIT and is the host of the public television series Searching: Our Quest for Meaning in the Age of Science. And now we're also thrilled to welcome back one of our very favorite people, Dacher Keltner, whom we hosted in 2016 and in 2023. Dr. Keltner is a professor of psychology at UC Berkeley and faculty director of the Greater Good Science Center. Dacher's research focuses on the biological and evolutionary origins of compassion, awe, love, beauty, power, social class, and inequality. It's pretty much all of it right there. He is the co-author of 2 textbooks, as well as the bestsellers Awe, Born to be Good, The Compassionate Instinct, and The Power Paradox. He has published hundreds of scientific articles and has written for the New York Times, the London Times, and the Wall Street Journal, among many others. And now let's welcome Alan Lightman and Dacher Keltner to FAN.
And it's good to be in conversation with you, Alan.
Thank you, Dacher.
I've been hoping for this for a long time, and it's quite an achievement to be a physicist and to be a National Book Award nominee in the world of novels. That's tough terrain to cross, so it's great to be with you. Reading The Miraculous from the material, your new book, was one of these books that just changed how I moved through the day. I was going to teach yesterday, and even in Berkeley, we have fall leaves, and the leaves are sort of this mixture of greens and then a lot of oranges and reds and yellows. And suddenly I had an explanation from you, and I went into my class and I'm like, I know I was supposed to be talking about the search for meaning and happiness, but I got to talk to you about fall leaves, which is one of the chapters in your remarkable book. So thank you for this beautiful book. And I want to ask you about how and why you wrote it in just a minute or two, and then dig into some details. But I wanted to ask you about your childhood in Tennessee, and you have reflections upon your childhood. And I wanted to ask you about this childhood laboratory that you had, and what you were doing in that laboratory, and what was ignited in those early endeavors.
Well, as a child, I was interested in both the sciences and the arts.
Yeah.
And so I did have a homemade laboratory, and I built rockets that had lizard passengers that came down on parachutes, and remote control devices that could turn on and off the lights in the house. I also wrote poetry and wrote short stories and read a lot. So I was interested in both the sciences and the arts from a very young age.
What do you I remember reading Janet Taylor Brown's biography of Charles Darwin, the 2-volume set, and it's incredible. And Darwin was like that too. And you see these kids like that. My daughter was very much like that. Darwin was collecting worms and didn't really care about formal school, but loved getting his hands dirty. What do you think you were starting to see as a child in the world of nature, in the miraculous and the material?
Well, I was curious about how things worked.
Yeah.
And I would say around the age of 10 or 12, I had read that for a pendulum, that the length of time for it to make a complete swing was proportional to the square root of the length of the pendulum. So I made some of my own pendulums with string and fishing weight tied to the end for the bob, and timed the periods with a watch. And measured the length with a ruler to see if this law was true.
What'd you find?
I found that it was true, and it worked every time, and I could even predict the periods of pendulums that I hadn't yet built. Once I, graphed the curve of this, and so that was my beginning to understand that nature is lawful,
Yeah.
and even quantitative. But I also, from an early age, started having what I might call spiritual experiences, like seeing a mist over a lake early in the morning and just being totally mesmerized by that. Going outside and looking at the stars and wondering how far far away they are. And so I developed an appreciation for nature from an early age also.
Yeah, it's remarkable to me, Alan. You're in Concord, Massachusetts, which is, of course, home of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And when I was doing research on nature-related awe, and your book is filled with awe and wonder and epiphany and transcendent experience, there's a moment, and you use the phrase spiritual materialist. And I was struck back by that, and taken aback, I should say. And Emerson, was, in Europe. He's a young man. His first wife had just died, I think, Ellen. And he was searching, like a lot of young people today, and like we all do, search for meaning, your public show, a TV show. And he goes into the Gallery of Comparative Anatomy, and I went to it as I was writing Awe, and it's all these skeletons and organs from other species, and you start to, knowing now evolution and design and, common origins and the like, you can sense it. But Emerson, this is, I think, the 1820s or 30s, and evolution's kind of in the air, and he's like, I'm going to be a naturalist. And what he was meaning is like, there's the divine in the material. What do you mean by spiritual materialist? Like, how did you come to that sense of yourself?
Well, I'm a materialist in the literal sense, that I think that everything is made out of atoms and molecules,
Yeah.
material, and there's no supernatural substance, there's no invisible essence. But I also have these spiritual experiences,
Yeah.
like looking at the stars at night, or seeing a beautiful lavender mist hovering over a lake, and feeling like I'm part of something larger than myself.
Yeah.
And so I think that we all have experiences like that. I think, whether you're a scientist or a non-scientist, I hope that we can be open to those experiences and embrace them.
Yeah.
So that's why I call myself a spiritual materialist.
Yeah. I when I was writing about awe, and I got to the chapter on spirituality, and around the world, mystical experiences in Hinduism and Buddhism and the Abrahamic traditions bring us awe, and 41% of Americans find the divine in nature. And I was so struck by your use of the phrase. And I remember one of the first interviews that I did on spirituality for this book was Malcolm Clemens Young, who's a reverend at Grace Cathedral, the dean of the cathedral. And he said, his first experience of spirituality was looking at a lake in Oregon, camping, and just the light, early morning, dawn light. What do those experiences bring for you? What do they feel like?
Well, first of all, they're just beautiful, and they appeal directly to my emotional sensibility. Yeah. They also make me feel like I'm a part of nature.
Yeah.
In my new book, The Miraculous from the Material, I give scientific explanations of these various beautiful phenomena, but being able to explain them scientifically does not diminish their power or meaning for me at all. In fact, that enhances my appreciation and awe of these phenomena.
I'd love to talk to you about the book, and maybe see some of your images. You know, it it's almost, the book, reading the book is almost like a page by page epiphany, where you begin with something that you see. You take us on a journey about why and how it exists, and then get into the science. And what was striking to me, and maybe we can soon see a few of the images that inspired you, is like you said, like, you know, a lot of people out in the world, they feel like, oh, science diminishes spirit. It takes away the magic of our relationship to nature or phenomena we don't understand. But I think it's just the opposite. And I think you know, you get down to the atoms and the physics and the certain kinds of math, and you're like, wow, look at what, this is why bubbles are so amazing, you know. But I'm curious about what inspired you to write this book, The Miraculous from Material, and maybe you could show us a few images and where it took you.
Well, the original inspiration for the book was I'm a runner,
Yeah.
although getting slower every year. And I was running by a field early in the morning, and I saw a low mist hanging over the field. That probably went up, 10 feet or something. And it was just gorgeous. And my first reaction was just to look at it with amazement and awe and appreciate it. But then when I got home, I began thinking, well, what caused that mist? And why is it so low on the ground? And why does it fade away as the sun gets higher in the sky?
Yeah.
So that was the beginning of the book.
Mm.
And then I began thinking of other phenomena that are beautiful and subject to scientific explanation. So I could show you a few pictures.
Yeah, I would love to see them. They meant a lot to me in reading your wonderful book, and I bet our audience would love to see them.
Well, each chapter of the book begins with a full page color photograph of some amazing and beautiful physical phenomena, and then there's I have to ask our listeners a little bit of forbearance here, because I'm going to have to fumble around a little bit with getting these pictures up. I'm going to start with mandarin fish. Let's see if I can get this full screen. And I'll just say that it's called a mandarin fish because of it looks like it's wearing the robes of a Chinese mandarin. Let me find another one.
Tell us where that led you, Alan. Like, what did you? Because there's many reflections in the book about color and the evolutionary significance of color.
Yeah, I began wondering what purpose do those colors serve? And I think most features that living organisms have had some survival benefit. In the case of mandarin fish, the elaborate colors are to warn potential predators that it's poisonous, and that's its defense mechanism, that it's poisonous. But if you don't tell a potential predator that you're poisonous, somehow it won't know, and it'll take a bite out of you before it figures out that you're poisonous. So you've got to broadcast that in some way. Here's another amazing phenomenon. This is called a fall streak hole, and it's so strange looking that some people thought it was a flying saucer. It's actually caused by a jet plane going through the air and crystallizing the water vapor in the air, which then drops out. Let me see if I can find another amazing picture.
Yeah.
This is called the fall streak. Not the fall streak, but a Yosemite Falls. This is a place in Yosemite where it looks like it's molten lava pouring over the side of the cliff. but actually there's one day of the year and a few hours of the day where the sun is at just the right angle that it lights up the water. That's actually water and not molten lava that's pouring over the side of the cliff there. Uh,
Mm.
Another amazing picture. Let me show you a couple of more.
Mm.
This picture is going to be very familiar to most people, the rings of Saturn.
Yeah.
The first time I saw the rings of Saturn out of a telescope, I was at the Harvard College Observatory, and I had some keys to the telescope, and a few of my friends and I had had a lot of wine to drink, and we wandered up to the telescope. I couldn't believe that anything was so perfect. I mean, those rings are so perfect, and it's a billion miles away. I just couldn't believe that anything in nature could be that perfect. And I go on, of course, to give an explanation of how the rings formed. I got a microscope when I was very young, and I think you mentioned, Dacher, that you had a microscope or you looked at these pyramids also. And with a microscope and a thimble full of water out of a pond, I discovered a whole invisible world.
Yeah.
You know, at a micro scale that I wasn't even aware of before. So that's a paramecium. Let me show you a couple of more. I went to Vietnam a few years ago, and there's a place in the northeast coast of Vietnam called Ha Long Bay, and there are these micro mountains that rise out of the ocean, very steep. They're made out of limestone, and they're carved by rainwater that dissolves the limestone. And I think there's a legend that there was a dragon that came to defend Vietnam against as many invaders, and the dragon dropped some of its green scales into the water, and that became these micro mountains. I'll show you one more.
Yeah.
I don't
These
want
are
to
wonderful.
bore our audience with too many pictures.
I could go on all night.
There are 36 of these things.
Mm.
This is a water spout, and it's basically a tornado that is over the ocean. And I was sailing in the Aegean Sea in Greece on my honeymoon, and one of these things came within a quarter of a mile of our boat. It could have just sucked us up into the sky.
Wow.
So there was mixed fear and amazement at the same time. So I'll stop there.
Yeah.
And thank you for indulging me there on those pictures.
What a journey. And thank you for the wonderful photos. I have a few questions about some of the scientific ideas that you introduced to the reader. And I think the reader will love the far-ranging discussion of atoms and molecules and physics and, ionization and the like. But one of the things that runs across this is your love of explanation and, just relying on the tools of science to explain things like, bioluminescence and the aurora borealis and, the colors of the fish and the like. And I'm wondering if you would just take one of your photos and just provide us a scientific explanation that brought you wonder and awe. And just tell us what science does for you.
Okay, well, should I go back to one of the folders?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go to a photo that we have here. Those of us who live in the Northeast are very familiar with the beautiful fall colors that, of course, that season has just passed. And the question is, where do those colors come from? Well, it turns out that all leaves all the time have the pigments for reds and oranges, yellows, but most of the year those pigments are masked by the strong green of the chlorophyll. in the leaves. Of course, a lot of growing things have chlorophyll, which converts sunlight into energy. But when the growing season slows down in the fall, there's not as much chlorophyll produced, and the red and orange and yellow pigments that are already there can come out to play because they're not masked anymore by the green. But the question is, of course, that's a seasonal thing. But what causes the seasons?
Right.
Well, the seasons are caused by the tilt of the Earth.
Yeah.
That in the summer months in the northern hemisphere, the northern part of the Earth is pointed away from the sun, and so it gets pointed toward the sun in the summer, so we get more sunlight and more heat. And when the Earth is on the opposite side of the sun, and the Earth's axis in the northern hemisphere is pointed away from the sun, we get less sunlight and less heat. And that's what causes the seasons. But you can go even deeper and ask what caused the tilt of the Earth. And that was a small planet or a large asteroid that hit the Earth during the formation of the solar system and cocked it over in its orbit about the sun. And in fact, most of the planets in our solar system have tilts. That is, their axis of rotation is not aligned with a perpendicular to the plane of the orbit about the sun. And so most of them have seasons, but the planet Mercury was not hit by a large asteroid, so its axis is perpendicular to the plane of the orbit, so it doesn't have any seasons. And therefore, if there were trees on Mercury, they would not change colors. There would be no fall leaves on planet Mercury.
And I have to just tell the audience, who I hope will be readers of this book, one of the wonderful things in this book is you've got poetry coming in from Emily Dickinson and Shelley and others, and of course the seasons have been the fount of all kinds of metaphor and poetry and novels and the like. It speaks to a humanities and science background, and it's remarkable just to think that a planet bumping into the Earth tilts our axis, and now we have the poetry of seasons. And I think for the reader, just each image has this exploration. But I'm curious, just your thinking. It reminded me a little bit just your adventures here of Darwin in Origin of Species, and as he kept observing nature, and having these feelings about he was arriving at this explanation. Took him 30 years of natural selection, but it was an aesthetic experience, and it was almost spiritual for him just to start to understand the deep evolutionary origins of things. And you do take the reader on that journey in all this wide-ranging array of phenomena. What does scientific explanation feel like for you?
Well, it feels like understanding the world at some level.
Yeah.
And of course, I know that your field is psychology, and you understand the human mind in a completely different way. Actually, I can ask you the question, how do psychologists learn about the human mind?
Yeah, well, and you end your book on the mind and consciousness, and we study language, and we study neurons and stories, and over in the field of emotion, we try to study the stream of consciousness and its elements, and but I think I feel that what you've achieved throughout your career, and then in this book, really crystallized of this synthesis of the story and the humanities and the reflection and the autobiography, plus the scientific narrative, is as close as we can get. But yeah, cognitive scientists like Alison Gopnik here at Berkeley are very interested in what your book's about, which is the joys of understanding. And it's so remarkable as a species that, we can look at a bubble, and once you dig into the physics of a bubble, you arrive at a deep principle, and it's thrilling.
Well, I think that human behavior is much more complicated than the physics of a bubble. So one question that I ask neuroscientists, and I can ask you as a psychologist, is, do you think that if we had a chemical and electrical readout of every neuron in the brain, all 100 billion of them, could we be able to predict whether two people would fall in love?
I do. I too am a materialist, in the sense, I think that one we could probably get 70% right with that kind of, full sort of characterization of the brain. I think there's a harder problem that you talk about at the end of the book that neurons and statistics won't ever get to, which is consciousness. I just think and you raise it at the very end as a striking question of, like, scientists offer these third person views, 100 billion neurons connected in thousands of ways, but feeling and consciousness and poetry is in the person. And I don't think we can.
So consciousness is a feeling.
Yeah.
I know there was a great philosopher named Thomas Nagel.
Yeah.
Who
Amazing.
said that which you probably know better than I do, who said that we will never be able to know what it feels like to be another animal. He was using the bat as an example, but of course he could have used any example.
Yeah.
Because we don't know what it feels like to be that other creature.
Yeah.
And a lot of people raise the question of whether artificial intelligence will ever be conscious.
Yeah.
And, I think that you can make a list of outward manifestations of consciousness, like self-awareness. We know that dolphins can recognize themselves in mirrors and things like that. You can make a finite list of attributes of consciousness, and I think sometime soon a computer will be able to check all the boxes.
Yeah.
But whether the computer is actually conscious as opposed to demonstrating the attributes of consciousness is a different question.
Yeah, I agree.
And you'd have to know what a computer feels like to know whether it's conscious or not. Do you agree with that?
I do. I think ultimately, in some irreducible sense, feeling is at the core of consciousness, and feeling is about life. It's about, as is beauty. And your book has many observations about beauty. It's about our relationship to living things and being alive and trying to survive and do the tasks of evolution. And that really is the substance of consciousness. And machines and algorithms and code aren't alive. They are not subject. They're inanimate material subject to different laws. And that's a big division, And it's interesting, like, one of the things we're thinking about in our lab is, and there's emerging science on this, like AI generated art. If you tell somebody it's an AI generated piece of art, it just doesn't feel the same,
It doesn't feel the same, even if it looks the same.
Yeah. And so
there's something about that. Well, a similar thing that has struck me at times. I have a pipe that my great grandfather had.
Wow.
And it has a lot of sentimental value to me.
Yeah.
Now, if you gave me another pipe that looked identical to that pipe, but it wasn't my great grandfather's pipe, it wouldn't mean the same to me.
Yeah.
Now, why is that?
Well, and it's just like philosophers have written about, the minute a painting is forged, it looks like a Rembrandt. It's the same thing. But once you say, this isn't painted by Rembrandt, you're like, I don't like it,
So why is that? You're a psychologist. Tell me why that is.
How come you're asking all the hard questions? I was going to ask you about bubbles and the minimum energy principle. I think there's something about relationality and being in relation to other living humans and beings that is consciousness. And the minute it's a simulation or artificially intelligently created entity, it's just a different being. So, and that's one of the problems of being online, is we're losing that distinction, I think. Let me ask you, Alan, one of the lovely properties of from the miraculous from the material is, and this just speaks to your mind, as we've learned since you were a child, is like Walt Whitman, you embrace it all, right? And many of your stories about these natural phenomena have poetry, personal reflections from your childhood, and also indigenous knowledge, indigenous stories about the Grand Canyon and what it meant. I loved your discussion of lightning and its invocation of earlier people's discussion of gods like Zeus. How do you bring together and integrate in your own view of the world these different ways of knowing? You go to the atomic and then the mythical, and what does it mean to you?
Well, the universe is a strange place.
It got stranger as I read your book, I have to say. I'm going to come back to bubbles.
we first start getting some kind of consciousness at age 3 or 4, and then we start at some point we become aware that this is a very strange place that we find ourselves in.
Yeah.
And we want to understand that. We want to understand it, and we one way of understanding is to tell stories. And ancient people didn't have the science that we do now, but they still wanted to understand. So they started telling stories, and a lot of our mythologies were an attempt to understand, also attempt to control.
Yeah.
Because if you have a story for something, if you think you can put it in a context, you understand it, you have some control over it. It doesn't totally control you.
Yeah.
And I think that the desire to understand and the desire to have some control in this baffling universe we find ourselves in is the source of mythology. It also might be the source of theology.
Yep.
And it's the source of science. And these different disciplines just have different methodologies and tools.
Yeah, it was interesting when I was doing research for awe. There's a Japanese animation tradition. The Japanese, their animation tradition, their illustration tradition is perhaps the greatest in the world.
Yeah.
And there's a whole tradition of yokai, which are these crazy figures, ghouls and demons and ogres and strange shapes. And it was all about explaining unusual things out in nature, weird sounds and the like.
Yeah.
What were some of the more baffling phenomena that you photographed or got photos of and wrote about? What still puzzles you?
Well, there are things that we still don't understand. Take spider webs.
Yeah.
And I love spider webs, and I think most people are sort of mesmerized by spider webs. Well, it turns out that the silk of spider webs has twice the tensile strength of steel. And what that means is that if you take a strand of spider web silk and a strand of steel that's the same diameter, it takes twice the force to break the spider web silk as it does the steel strand. And yet the spider web silk is flexible.
Yeah.
So it has this amazing property of being both incredibly strong and flexible.
Wow.
And so we still, when I say we, I mean the scientific community, still doesn't understand exactly how the molecular structure of spider webs has this dual property of being both incredibly strong and incredibly flexible.
You think they'll figure it out?
Well, I think they'll figure it out at some point. But learning this just increased my admiration of spiders. I mean, they're artists, they're engineers, creators, they're amazing creatures.
Yeah. And I loved how, reading your book, it was, and I think anybody who really closely observes nature like Jane Goodall and Darwin and
Yeah.
von Humboldt and all the great naturalists, Emerson to a lesser extent,
Mhm.
is humbled. You know, I love your discussion of the hummingbird and its heartbeat, how fast it's beating its wings, and
Yeah.
and how fast certain single cell organisms go. Was really wonderful to read. I wanted to kind of dig into um, sort of a theme in the book in your different writings, which is scale, uh, and what it means to you and what it's taught you in your own life. And in many ways, a lot of the chapters are about just just deep, unexpected forms of scale that are all around us. You know, the scale of time of the Grand Canyon. Your story of the fall leaves tracing back to the
Formation.
geologists.
Yeah.
Yeah. The all the things that are invisible, in your experience, the paramecium. Um, what has it taught to you? What has it taught you about life? Just these explorations in time and space and origin and scale.
Well, I think that it's made me feel small. I mean, in the 20th century, we've learned. I know we're in the 21st century now, but in the 20th century, we learned how to measure distances to the stars, and we learned how to measure the size of our galaxy, and we learned how to measure the distances to other galaxies, and we're just unfathomably tiny compared to cosmic scales.
Yeah.
So I've been made, I've become more aware of how tiny I am. You know, we're just on one planet that's orbiting a star that's on the outskirts of a galaxy that has 100 billion stars in it and 100 billion galaxies within view of the telescope. On the other hand, I feel big in another way with the knowledge that the human mind has been able to grasp
Yeah.
all of these scales,
Yeah.
atoms that are much, much smaller than us and galaxies that are much, much larger than us. And we're able to understand how how long ago the universe formed, 14 billion years ago, which is an incredible number of human lifetimes. Uh, and the fact that our human minds have been able to figure all of this out,
Yeah.
where these ants on this one tiny planet in the cosmos, we've been able to figure all of this out is
It's
really,
incredible.
it's incredible.
It
It's
is. And I just, sorry about the interruption, but I have to let the audience know, I'm a scientist, you're a scientist, and your book is this love song to science in some ways. And it's, for just the elegant short chapters, you learn about carbon dating and the color spectrum and, and the discovery of the von Leeuwenhoek in 17th century Holland and figuring out the microscope. And it's wonderful to be amazed at science.
well, to me, it's a love song about science, but it's also a love song about the natural world
Yeah. Yeah.
and just the phenomena that are out there.
Yeah.
And I think that our first reaction to these phenomena is not a scientific reaction, it's an emotional reaction.
Yep.
And then the science comes later.
Yeah.
And I don't want that emotional reaction to be lost.
No.
And 500 years from now, when Homo sapiens is evolved into Homo techno,
Yeah.
when we're part human and part machine, I hope that we still have that emotional reaction to the natural world.
And I think that, the one of the things that really struck me, this is true, of course, in a lot of the new indigenous scholarship, that their understanding of life and cosmology came out of their understanding of the natural world. It's actually, if you read Ralph Waldo Emerson on nature, and I think the longer version it's all about how the operations of the mind come out of our relationship to the natural world. And I think a lot of what you teach in this book has that quality to it that, for me, looking just your writings about the snowflake and spiral forms in plants, and just how we suddenly realized that, yeah, a lot of how I think um, about human relationships and social psychology in terms of their symmetry as a form of egalitarianism. That's probably a deep principle that we learn. We're just replicating or resembling a law of nature and growth. And spirals feels very much a property of the human mind. So I hear you. I hope we do not lose touch with the natural world. I wanted to ask you as we head into our last 10 minutes together, you know, you end your last chapter is about humans and about the mind and about the brain and its 100 billion neurons and thousands of connections between each cell, you know, and then we don't even know about, you know, all the the various forms of cells in there that are still being characterized. Why do you call it the most complicated organism in the universe or living form?
Well, I think maybe the most complicated thing that we know of, period.
Really?
We can, yeah, I mean, we can build very good models of stars. And, you know, once you know the laws of gravity and electromagnetism, and you know the chemical composition of a star, you pretty much know everything about the star. You can predict how hot it is, how bright it will be.
Yeah.
We know a lot about black holes.
Yeah.
You know, once you specify the mass and the amount of spin of a black hole, you really know everything about it. You
Yeah.
can predict
You can
what
make
it's
point
going to do.
predictions, as they say.
Yeah. But with the human brain, you've got 100 billion neurons that are all interacting with each other and changing each other in both directions. They're constantly changing each other. Even if you go into an isolation tank and there's no sensory input, and I did that once in California.
Of course, in California.
You got to do it in California. If you don't go into an isolation tank, you haven't been to California.
Even down there at Caltech, I bet they had them in your dorm rooms.
Even when you cut off all sensory input, the brain is still doing some amazing things with all of the neurons chattering back and forth with each other.
Yeah.
And, you know, when you try to simulate a brain with digital neurons, once you get more than about 10 or 20 of them that are all interacting with each other, it becomes very difficult to predict what that system is going to do. That's what it's 10 or 20. And as you say, we have 100 billion neurons in our brain, each one of them connected to 1,000 other neurons. It's just an incredibly complex system, and all kinds of fascinating qualitative behavior comes out of that system, like the feeling of consciousness.
Yeah.
Or,
I want to pause for a moment, Alan.
yes.
And I hope there are fit scientists out in the audience listening, because as a social scientist, where I struggle to predict things, and most of our effects, as they say, are small, right? My physicists, chemists, colleagues are like, I can predict things perfectly. What's wrong with you guys? And I'm just going to use this moment to tell those people, look what happens when you just get a couple dozen neurons, and it's chaotic, and the math's hard, and it's a mess.
You can't do it.
Yeah.
You can predict. So you were telling me a few minutes ago that you thought that we will eventually be able to say there's a 70% chance that I will fall in love with some particular person.
You doubt that.
I think you're being optimistic, but I can tell you another thing. I hope, even though I'm a scientist, I hope that there's never a computer that can tell me who I'm going to fall in love with.
Yeah, they won't be
I,
able to
I,
do
I just reject that possibility.
it. Don't sign up for that app.
I'm not signing up for that.
It's so humbling to hear you talk about this, and I hear you. When you move into um, your conversations with neuroscientists, and you do your last chapter in this wonderful book is about humans. What amazes you about humans? Like what? And I appreciate, this is a hard time right now. People are
Yeah.
looking at the rise of authoritarianism and polarization and loneliness, and we can't seem to stick to the Paris Protocol, et cetera. And we're like, God, what's wrong with us? Uh, there are people who are very optimistic about our progress. Steve Pinker over at Harvard. Sarah Bakewell has a great book out on humanism that's really, and you squarely are in that tradition. What amazes you about this human brain and our conscious lives?
Well, I think that despite the politics in the U.S. and in the world, um, that we still have have compassion for other people. We still love people, and I think that we can still, despite what may be happening in the larger world, we can still focus on our local community and try to do small good things in our local community, and that gives meaning. It provides joy, happiness.
Yeah,
So that's my strategy.
yeah. Uh, just a few more questions, Alan, and one of them is um, a little bit personal, and but also um, I think a challenging one, which is, I have such admiration for your work.
Thank you.
A scientist, MIT physicist, uh, National Book Award for a novel. This book, is such a seamless integration of story and atomic analysis and scientific measurement and scientific history. And we're you're kind of this, you're almost this sui generis, as they say, like you're this one thing of like somebody who's writing novels and doing science and exploring science. What do you tell young scientists and young writers and people interested in this? How did you get here, and how to stay inspired in this hard work?
Well, I think that many children, and I'll start with young people, have interest in both the sciences and the arts.
Yeah,
Or you can generalize that and say that they have an inclination to the rational way of thinking and also the intuitive way of thinking. So if we expand the science and art category to a larger way of being in the world, and unfortunately, I think
yeah,
for young people, their parents and their children and their teachers often push them in one direction or the other,
yep,
because it's easier to get through life if you're one kind of person or the other kind. And I think that we should resist that pressure.
yeah,
So that's my advice. Sometimes young people come to me and they have dual interests. They might be interested in chemistry and also playing the violin, and they say, "What should I do?" And my advice is, don't give up either one.
yeah,
Try. They're both part of you, and don't cut off a part of yourself.
yeah, yeah. And when you think about, a lot of universities right now, are their Shakespeare classes and their philosophy classes are diminishing in enrollment, and students don't take literature and they don't have history, and
Yeah, we may be putting too much emphasis on STEM
yep, yeah,
subjects, and I think that's a great loss, because our STEM subjects, our philosophy, our history, our literature, our music, our art, are where we get our human values.
yeah,
And you can't have science without human values. You need human values to guide science, but to guide our civilization as a whole.
Yeah,
The
absolutely.
humanities are extremely important, and we should not be diminishing them.
Yeah, I hear you. Hear, hear. I want to ask two final questions or three final questions, and I'm trying, it's wonderful in your book because you'll have discussions of, aurora borealis or a particular fish or lightning or, certain kinds of clouds that are still enigmatic and beautiful images of the clouds. And then every now and then there are these Alan Lightman sort of disclosures of feeling and just like I still this is how I feel. This makes me feel amazed and astonished and one of your statements is and I loved how it appeared is like flowers make you happy.
Yes,
And
pretty trite, but true.
no, but it's deep. What do you make of that?
They're beautiful. Beauty makes me happy. Um, uh, they're natural. I mean, look at all the beautiful things that nature creates.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. And then the reader will be taken on this wonderful adventure into thinking about, oh, there's actually striking evolutionary significance for a beautiful color that we photograph that
Yes,
often. Um,
yes.
and then I guess, one of the things that really struck me in this book, we did a study that I'm very proud of that we're following up um, on walks and what we had people do. Uh, and it was actually something that I did for a magazine where we did it in Muir Woods, which is this national park in California. You've probably been there. A lot of people go. Sort of the UN was the documents for the UN were first signed, and the idea is you just wherever you walk, even in a city, wherever it is, there's always nature and beauty and wonder to take in. And your book has sunsets and clouds and funnel clouds and storms and lightning and rain and water. And that's true. And I agree with you. Just what it exposes to you is just the beauty of life. And in our participants who are elderly, they're heading towards 80, derive a lot of benefits just from doing an all walk. And your book felt like an all walk to me. It felt like, which is a real testimony. Like you can, read start with an image, read its scientific understanding, start to feel something about it. And it's like you see it, and that's what's available to us in our lives. So, Alan Lightman, what are some of the wonders of everyday the material world that is miraculous for you? What should we all go out and go look for?
Well, taking a walk in the woods. I mean, I'm married to a beautiful woman, and I love looking at her.
Hmm.
Uh, I have children. I love looking at them. I love looking up at the sky at night. If you're far away, if you're not too close to the lights of a city, I love looking at the night sky. So those are just a few things.
Yeah. And for the interested audience member, the book has that quality to it. Final question, this is a time when big thinkers like yourself are looking at the world and, there's a lot that's remarkable. We don't lose a third of our children before the age of 2. And, the world used to be 90% impoverished and hungry, and now that's down to 8 to 10%. And, but, climate crisis, species loss, it's disheartening. And it's a good time for all of us just to hear, just like Jane Goodall, like the resilience of life kind of brings her hope. And I agree. And just the resilience of the natural world. What are you finding hope in these days? What makes you look forward to the next book and the next conversation?
Well, I have confidence in the human spirit, and you mentioned the word resilience. And I think that there's a lot of trouble in the world, a lot of bad things going on. But I see people who inspire me with their commitment and their courage. And that gives me hope. That's what keeps me going.
Yeah. Over in the philosophical literature, we call it moral beauty. That
Moral beauty. Yes,
human
that's a good word for it.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Dacher.
Dacher, thank you so much for such a thoughtful, knowledgeable, present, focused, attentive conversation with Alan. He and his book were well served by your efforts, and Fan and our audience is very grateful to you for your time. I know you're a very busy person, and what a beautiful match of two people looking at some of the very similar things, but also have your very distinct identities and how you view things. It was a pleasure to listen to this conversation, and we look forward to hearing more about moral beauty in just a couple of years, is what I'm hoping. I want to remind folks, Alan is going to be joining us for After Hours. That's another 55 minutes with Alan. Ask him questions, give your own observations. Maybe some of you have some beautiful photos of nature you want to share as well on the screen. After Hours is interactive. Ask your own questions. You can be on camera. It's a great opportunity. You buy a copy of Alan's book from our bookseller. We've been putting the links in chat. They'll send you the receipt. We'll have the link to register for After Hours and come hang out with us. We're going to give Alan a 5-minute break after this webinar ends. I'm going to pose one fast question here, really fast. And it was from Lachlan, and he says, Albert Schweitzer, Martha Nussbaum, Howard Thurman, and others trace the source of morality and its motivating power to our sense of awe and reverence for the life around us and our natural resulting sense of responsibility for that life. Question for Alan or both. In your experiences of awe and wonder, does this ring true? If so, how can we help others, especially young people, make this connection? So I'd love to hear from both of you. I know we're a little short on time, but I'd love to hear from both of you.
Dacher, you want to go first on that?
Yeah, thank you, Alan. And I'll just echo what an honor it was to be in conversation with you, and what an inspiration you are.
An honor for me to be with you, Dacher. Thank you.
Yeah, you know, we the experience of awe and wonder, which it runs throughout Alan's book, it reminds us we are small and that we have to give to the world and revere it. And it just prompts us to want to treat things with greater care in the preservation of life. And that's, you know, be it the environment or people around you or a piece of music that you're playing. And it is the fount of morality, I believe, as Plato believed and others. So I say hear, hear to the question.
Here. And Alan, if you want to offer a quick note.
Well, I'm familiar with a phrase that Schweitzer introduced, and I don't remember the German, but it translates to the reverence for life. And I think reverence is a word that Dacher just used. So I think that we're all better people by having reverence for things around us and gratitude. I don't think we show nearly enough gratitude, not only to the natural world, but to other people who have helped us come to where we are.
Yeah, thank you for that. Here's my gratitude on behalf of everyone in Fanland to the two of you. Alan, we'll see you in about 5 minutes. Dacher, I wish I was seeing you in 5 minutes, but I'm going to find you.
Off to my lab.
Yeah.
The science continues.
Enjoy your holiday season, Dacher, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and we'll be opening up After Hours in about 5 minutes. Thank you, everyone. Good night.